Yeah, now it should work. Okay. So sorry about that. Well, we were talking about principal components. Here we have this higher dimensional data set. And what we kind of like want to do is reduce this down to like a single dimensional space, right? And so what are basically the question we want to ask is, which of these like countries are the most similar to each other? And if we take this 16-dimensional data or so and reduce it down, or 17-dimensional data, and reduce it down to the first principal component, we kind of get this kind of like Wales is more similar to England than to Scotland, and Scotland is more similar to England than to Wales, and Northern Ireland is kind of like the big outlier here, right? That's quite different from everybody else. And so if we look over this again, Northern Ireland, interestingly, they don't seem to drink as much. They like cereals is about the same, right? But then we have here this big difference in potatoes, and well, yeah, that's probably mostly driving it. And then here soft drinks and so on. So this is exactly what we want to do when we use any kind of dimensionality reduction. We want to kind of take a data set like this and produce something like this. Exactly. Yes. And if we do this with two principal components, we can see a little bit more nuance here, right? So here, you know, more or less the same major thing that's going on, that Northern Ireland is an outlier, but I guess we get a little bit more structure, that Northern Ireland is actually not so, like it's like about as different from Scotland as it is from England, right? Which is something that we didn't get in the one-dimensional version here. And so the more dimensions you kind of add to your principal components, and more principal components you show, the more variance you can capture. But of course, then it becomes pointless at some point, because you know you want to reduce the space. A very similar approach, but slightly different in terms of the mathematics behind it, is multidimensional scaling. There's multiple like actual mathematical approaches behind it. It works based on projecting a similarity matrix. So what you do is you take, like in clustering, right? You take a vector of data, you compute a similarity matrix based on some distance, distance function, for example, Euclidean distance or some correlation measure, and then you project this down to 2 dimensions. And the big questions for these different approaches is like, how do you compute a the similarity similar to what we had with clustering, and how do you project the points? And this is like what this paper here uses by Marian Dirk and his students, and this is very popular for text analysis, for example. And one big issue with all of these dimensionality reduction techniques is, of course, that they may introduce artifacts. So you can never completely trust just a 2D projection of a data set, right? Because you always have some information loss, and sometimes the actual distances you see between certain points doesn't make sense. And so here's like a good example of this. This is a topical distance between theses in different departments. And the problem with this is that if we look closely, we can see petroleum engineering here. Like this is like basically taking thesis, taking the text of thesis and doing multidimensional scaling based on a text of thesis. And so ideally you would expect that the thesis of similar subjects contain similar language, and then they would kind of like reduce down to the space, and they should kind of appear together here in the spot. And kind of like intuitively this makes sense. So like medicine, pharmacology, microbiology, biochemistry, genetics, biology, they kind of all cluster around here, right? So that is kind of like a sensible thing. Then we have some engineering fields here, but then we have petroleum engineering, which kind of seems to be about as similar to neurobiology than to, let's say, any of these engineering fields over here, right? And that doesn't make sense. Petroleum engineering and neurobiology probably don't share much information. And so one thing that you can do is you can show these kind of like distances for a selected point instead of trying to show everything at one time. And so in this tool here, let's see whether it's still working. Yeah. Well, maybe not. In this tool here, you can basically pick any of these kind of like departments or the things that you actually visualize. And then you dynamically readjust the distances to focus only on this one point. And so what they're doing here is they kind of like take a circle approach, and then the distance to that point, like on the radius here, is kind of like tells you how similar these items are. And what we can see now is that petroleum engineering is actually quite similar to civil engineering, and neurobiology, which is over here, right, is actually completely dissimilar. What we can learn from this is that what we saw here, this distance that seemed to be the smallest, is really just an artifact of the algorithm, right? It's not something that is actually in the data. And so that's the thing that we always have to be careful about. They would be like, these are kind of meaningless, they're unitless, right? They just plot some variance, some distance. And that's kind of like what you have to, basically, have to know the algorithm that you use, and you have to understand how to interpret it. So for example, in PCA, you can make some kind of assumptions about points, like about the distance between different points. But in t-SNE, which we'll later talk about, you can really only make assumptions about things that belong in one cluster, right? And if two clusters are close, that doesn't actually mean that those elements are close. And so generally for all of these dimensionality reduction things, there's no meaningful unit, right, on the axis. It's really just like these things are similar, and you can kind of do with it what you want. Okay, and so this is another project that is kind of like really goes into this. Now quickly play this video here.
Probing projection. We describe the same interaction technique analyzing dimensionality. In this video, we're going to demonstrate the prototype web app. On the left, you can see the projection. In this case, it's a data set of OECD countries, reduced from 8 to 2 dimensions using multi-dimensional scaling. On the right-hand side are panels containing settings projection. Displays of predefined classes, user selections, and clusters, as well as a list of all the data sets I mentioned. We'll walk through these. Let's start with projection. To examine a sample, you hover over it. For example, let's examine what makes a circle outcome. Hovering over a dot displays a tooltip. For each dimension, there are 30 values, as well as how it compares. From top to bottom, you can see the various dimensions. Left to right, there are the absolute value, the standard deviation, and graphical representation of them. These values are color-coded, show where they deviate from the rest of the space. Instead of comparing Turkey to the whole list, let's compare it to just a single other country. To do this, we first select Turkey by clicking, and then hover over another country. Again, the tooltip displays a list of dimensions. But this time, it shows the absolute values of it, numerically as well as graphically. Graphical representation is designed to emphasize dimensions in countries are most similar. To analyze multiple countries, we select them using a rectangular selection. Immediately, the dimensional values are plotted in the list of dimensions on the right, visually comparing this selected group of countries to the rest of the data. The tooltip displays these differences in greater detail. The selection can be named and saved for later. Comparing groups of countries is done similarly. We select another group of countries. Their dimensional values plotted in the list of dimensions. Again, the tooltip showing more details is available as well. Comparisons work with any number of selections. Clustering is also available. The number of clusters can be adjusted with the slider. The display is updated live while sliding.
This is, of course, a hierarchical clustering here.
Clusters can be analyzed just like selection. They can be compared with other clusters or user selection. For later reference, it can also be named and saved as. Look at the samples of the data set. Now let's take a look at dimension. A list of dimensions is available on the right-hand side. It provides spatial and numerical representation of each dimension. Spatial distribution is displayed with a heat map, showing where values fall on the projection. These heat maps can be used to get a general spatial overview of the projection, visually map dimensional values to clusters, or to compare different dimensions with each other. On hover, the heat map is also overlaid onto the projection.
So this here kind of like is interesting, right? Because it shows you for the value.
Or to compare different dimensions with each other.
It shows you kind of like the values that are in that particular dimension that are driving this here. So here we're looking at, what is it? Educational attainment, right? And we see that educational attainment is very high in Japan and Korea, but also in Canada, United States, right? But not so high in Brazil and Mexico. So we kind of like can like take here this information about an individual dimension into account and see how much it influences our projection. More or less, yes. And by the way, this was a class project from an undergraduate student, which is very impressive. Okay. You've probably all heard about t-SNE, right? It's kind of like everybody's talking about it, and mostly people are talking about t-SNE and UMAP because it's useful in machine. Like if you want to kind of like look at data sets that you typically use for machine learning, so you can get like a sense of lower dimensional embeddings, that's what's going on in your data. So t-SNE stands for T-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding. It is like a nonlinear algorithm, and we have different transformations for different regions. I hear the mathematics are extremely complex. I've actually not looked into it myself, and I'm not going to try to explain any of it. But I kind of want to just point to, like PCA and like dimensionality reduction, you have to be careful about how to use it and how to interpret it. And so there's this series of really nice articles that kind of like try to build an intuition for how t-SNE really works and what kind of patterns you can expect from an algorithm. So here on the left, I can choose different, on the right, I can choose different inputs. And then I can see what t-SNE does over the cycles that it's running an algorithm here. And so you can see that, like if you go to something like this, it starts off pretty badly, but then kind of like nicely separates the three clusters. Also note that the input here, which is maybe a little hard to see for everybody, but those points here, the orange and the blue ones are actually very close together, and the green ones are not, right? But they kind of end up in the similar distance in the output. So that already tells you that you shouldn't really interpret the different aspects here, like the distances between the clusters too much, but you can rather rely on the clusters that are forming. And so you can kind of see what does t-SNE do with different inputs, and sometimes it changes a lot. And then also like some measures really matter a lot. The perplexity, these hyperparameters, like if I do perplexity of 22, you kind of see that it's like slightly different. And so there's like a lot of explanations here. So this here kind of like explains, for example, like the hyperparameters really matter. So you have to experiment a little bit. If you have a perplexity of 2 in this data set of 2 clusters, you kind of get this like not very nice result, right? But if you have a perplexity of 5, maybe 30 and 50, it is great again. But if you have one of 100, as you have here, then it again doesn't work, right? So it really like depends a lot on your algorithms. And then similarly, The cluster sizes don't mean anything. So like no matter how big things are, it really isn't particularly important. Distances between clusters often don't mean anything, and so on. And so like definitely take a look at this. And another thing that's always very useful is whenever you develop an algorithm, try feeding it, or even a visualization, right? Try feeding it with random noise. And if you start to see structures, there's probably something wrong, right? Like your algorithm shouldn't produce structure from random noise, but you could make an argument that some of these here kind of like start to create structures, and you could start to misinterpret the structure even when we had random noise as input. And then topology is tricky, is what this is basically saying. And like here you see some interesting things, right? These two rings as originals, and t-SNE eventually kind of like does this very nicely. This is of course very different from anything that PCA would do here. And UMAP, there's like a similar explainer, and this is, by the way, this is all coming from Google Pair. This is this AI and humans in the loop research group at Google that has two famous researchers, Martin Wartenberg and Fernanda Viegas. They and their team developed many of these explainers, and they played with these techniques. This one here is a similar one for UMAP. I'm gonna kind of skip over this a little bit. And then just like one really cool application of MDS is this time curves approach. And so what they're doing is they're taking temporal complex data, like Wikipedia articles that change over time, right, as they're being edited, or cloud cover or any other thing. And they're plotting the position, like they're plotting these different points or in time using like a multidimensional scaling. And then here you see kind of like the global cloud circulation. It kind of like, you see these transitions. So here it's a fairly stable state, and then suddenly here it's changing a lot, and then here's more cloudy, and then here's an interesting one. This is a Wikipedia article of Palestine, and you can see this article at first evolves. There's some minor changes, but then here we get into an edit war. Somebody like really changes a lot about the article, right? And we see this, like this version here is very dissimilar from this version. And then they keep editing it a little bit, then somebody reverts it. And then somebody again edits it back to something completely different, and then somebody reverts it. And so they get into you can kind of spot these kind of scenarios here. And this is also interactive, and so you can play with this on this at this link here if you like. That's it for multidimensional scaling. I want to move on to the next topic, but are there any questions about this? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where storytelling really comes in, right? Like you should basically know about the algorithm that you're using. What are the things that you can really think about? But then you kind of need to annotate something, right? You need to say, here are the elements that group together, and here's why these are similar, right? And I think that the approaches that we saw in this video, right, were showing the actual numerical values and making comparisons, and maybe even using like a data set as a reference that people are familiar with, like countries people are familiar with, right? So, and if you see that Eastern European countries cluster nicely together and Asian countries cluster nicely together, you kind of get a sense that this is reasonable. But generally, you kind of have to tell the story, right? You have to work with annotations and with captions and so on if you want to tell this to a general audience. But these are typically not general public plots, right? These are very often used in molecular biology, like in single cell sequencing or something like this, or in machine learning, right, to kind of do data exploration ahead of time. I think that, yeah, the paper, the technique with the artists and so on, it was kind of like the most, most publicly accessible version that I've seen of something like this. Okay. Great, so then let's move on. Great, so I want to start off with task analysis, because task analysis is something very essential in data visualization, right? Like we've talked mostly about how we build visualizations, and I've always hinted at tasks. So when we remember, we were looking at, topology tasks versus attribute tasks in networks. So we're looking at, understanding a correlation in tabular data. But now I want to talk a little bit more about how do we do this task analysis in real world problems. And so generally in visualization research, there's this space between problem-driven and technique-driven work. And everybody except for visualization researchers only cares about problem-driven, right? Like we want to visualize our data because we want to communicate something. Like a newspaper journalist want to visualize the data because they want to communicate something. A biologist want to visualize the data because they want to understand the problem. But these researchers tend to also care about techniques. And so these are kind of like different approaches. So the problem-driven is this top-down approach where you identify a problem encountered by users, and then you design a solution to help your users work more effectively. We call this sometimes like a design study because we're designing something and then we're studying it, how it came to be. And then there's technique-driven approaches where like I want to build a new graph layout algorithm, for example, right? I have my optimization method that I want to use to do that, or I'm using some fancy math. And you want to invent new visualization techniques or algorithms to do that. And then typically you classify or compare against other idioms. Other idioms, by idiom I just mean visualization techniques and algorithms. And so this is one of the papers that you should be reading if you're a grad student for the test, but I'll also be talking about this now in detail. This is kind of like this nested model for visualization design and validation. And so that kind of like gets a little bit in the theory of how you can approach a visualization design problem. And the nested model captures design decisions. Like it kind of makes you think a little bit about what is the justification behind the design that you're choosing. And it's about analyzing aspects of the design process. If you kind of break apart the process into different components, and if you're aware of which part you're working on, then it's actually easier to like make good choices and to think about where does this kind of break down. And then it also encourages you to validate early and often to avoid making ineffective solutions. And so here's kind of like the figure. Like this is the nested model. So you have these four things that are nested in each other. The first one, like whenever you try to build a visualization, you want to think about domain problem characterization, right? What problem is this solving? What is the data set and so on? What that I can get here. And then you get into the lowest step here, data and operation abstraction design, right? You're thinking about like, what are the data sets that I need to answer this domain problem? What are the operations that I need to kind of like get closer to tackling this problem? And then at the next level here, this is actually what we mostly covered in this course so far, right? This encoding and interaction technique design. So given a data set and given a task, what can I do? What are the things that I can do to visualize it? What are the interaction techniques that I can build? And then finally, on this block, we also haven't done much, right? This would be like implementing your own force-directed layout, for example, right? Or implementing your own B-swarm thing, right? So this level here is something that you would also have to consider if you do something from scratch. Of course, sometimes libraries can help you with this. And splitting it up like this lets you think about what are some threats to validity. Like it's maybe just a fancy way of saying, what are things that could go wrong at each of these stages? And how could you validate it, either before you build something or after you build something? And so in the domain problem characterization, the threat could be that you're actually working on the wrong problem. You can validate this by observing and interviewing target users, right? So if you have a vague sense of what you want to do, but your sense doesn't match up with what people actually need, the way to make sure you do is to like actually talk to the people that need this, right? Then just like give you a second example here, the thread for the encoding interaction technique design stage would be choosing an ineffective encoding or interaction technique. And the validation here is really like the pre-implementation validation here is kind of tricky, right? You have to kind of theoretically justify this, right? Like I have learned this in my Viz class, and these are the kind of the principles, the design principles, and we know this from this paper, and therefore this should actually work reasonably well. But then of course, if you implement it, you can do something else. You can, like after you've built the technique, you can do a second validation step where you could do some qualitative or quantitative data analysis, right? You could run a study, you could see how it works in a lab study, or you could measure human time errors, or you could do log data, the log file analysis. You could basically test on any users, right? And so all of these have kind of like this, except for the data operation abstraction design, all of them have kind of like a way to validate before you build, which is important, right? Because you're saving a lot of time, but also a way to validate after you build. So if you have a slow algorithm, you can validate that the algorithm is not slow anymore by measuring system time or memory, right? And then, but like, so you kind of like, a different way of thinking about this is this figure here, right? The design process for visualization techniques is kind of like has these stages. You have to first understand the domain problem. And especially if you work in like as a visualization designer, like I do, then you kind of like really, this is a very important part, right? We actually developed research methods to do this part better, right? Like how can we do interviews effectively? How can we understand what people actually want? Once you understand the domain problem, you kind of map it to abstract tasks. So, you know, I want to find whatever genes that indicate that a particular drug works, right? That's not an abstract visualization task. What you want to do is you want to break this down. I want to compare two groups of items that have an average value that is significantly different or something like this, right? And then you bring in data types and other factors. And then, like, basically, you know, what are my data types? What are some other aspects? It has to be in the web. It has to be on mobile or whatever. And then, based on all of this information, you can identify and implement a suitable technique. And this identifying is actually quite important. Okay, so domain characterization is all about the details of an application domain. So it's what a group of users or a target domain needs. It's about their questions and their data. And this is extremely diverse, right? There's like so many different things that people want to use visualization for. And so it varies widely by domain. But it must also be specific enough to continue with, right? So like sometimes people have some vague sense of what they want, but maybe haven't completely articulated it to themselves. And it might not be the right point to start a visualization project. And the other thing is that in practice, you cannot just ask people what they do or what they want, right? You have to kind of like work on this a little bit. You have to observe them because introspection is hard and not like what we think of ourselves. That is kind of the most important part of our job is maybe not actually what we're doing all the time. So in domain problem characterization, we have this infinite number of domain tasks, which can then be broken down into simpler abstract tasks. And this is kind of like this big thing that we call task abstraction, right? Taking a complex problem, a science problem, or some kind of like another analytical problem, and mapping it down to something where you can go into this financial times chart, right? Oh yeah, I want to see a correlation between those two dimensions. And if we know these abstract tasks, you now, after kind of almost finishing this class, you know which visualization techniques to pick, right? So basically, you can just like think about, okay, what did we learn about these tasks? What did we learn about these data sets? By thinking about those things, then you can kind of probably identify a visualization technique that can help you solve it. And so if you identify this task-data combination, then the solution for many, many cases probably already exists, right? If you can do this abstraction. So here's like a simple example. I want to build a visualization that helps me find good movies. I want to, good movies in genre I like. The domain here would be the general population or movie enthusiasts, right? And so the data and task abstraction is this, so yeah, this was just an example for the domain, and I'll keep going back to this after I've talked about data and task abstraction. So data and task abstraction is the what and the why, and it's mapping it into generalized terms. So we want to identify these like abstract tasks that users wish to perform or already do, and find the data types and a good model of the data. Sometimes, and quite often actually, the data that you can immediately have isn't quite the right thing, right? You have to do some data transformation. And I'm sure that many in your projects also discovered that your raw data that you downloaded or that you kind of acquired in some way isn't like the perfect solution. You had to do some grouping, some mapping, some transformation, and so on. And this can, of course, be very specific to the task. And so if we go back to our Find Good Movies example, we have to ask the question, what is a good movie for me? Is it highly rated by critics? Is it highly rated by audiences? Is it successful at the box office? Is it similar to movies I liked? Is it only in specific genres? And then if I have kind of figured all of this out, I can start thinking about where do I get this data from, right? I can scrape IMDb, I can scrape or use the API for Rotten Tomatoes and download these data items to kind of like start to tackle this problem. And then on the encoding and interaction level, this is really where the design of the visualization technique happens. So like I designed the visual encodings, I designed the interactions, and I'm thinking about the ways to create and manipulate the visual representation of the data. And these individual decisions, they may be separate or they may be intertwined. And here is really where the visualization design principles that we talked about all the time in this lecture, they drive these decisions. So if I had this find good movies thing, I could do something like we talked about when we talked about ranking, right? So for example, I might have decided a combination of audience ratings and critics rating is what I want, because I don't really just want to see movies that critics love, but the audience hated. But I also don't want to ignore critics, right? They kind of help me filter out something. So I could do some combination of them. And to do that, I could have this stacked bar chart for rating. And I could have a filter interface for genres. And that would kind of like help me solve that problem here. So this is like a, the movies example is as a simplified version of this. But, in more complicated scenarios, typically we even explicitly do this when we write up a research paper. So here's like a column from a paper I wrote a while ago. The goal here was to control data quality for gene splicing data. And so like this is one of these goals here. There's 4 different goals that we explicitly like identified in like a long process of understanding the user needs. And then after we've identified these goals, we broke it down to tasks. And these tasks are actually now pretty kind of like, specific to the data, or abstract actually. The judge magnitude of a sample, right, is like a very abstract task that I can apply both for movies and for gene expression, or compare samples or compare groups. These are all very kind of like generic tasks, very abstract tasks that work widely. And basically by identifying how do these goals map to these tasks, I can solve this problem. So we talked about tasks intuitively, but you can also structure tasks a little bit more, let's say, analytically. And in our textbook, Tamara Manzner divides these into these like analyze, search, and query tasks. So analyze is about the high-level choices and consume versus produce. Searching is about finding an unknown or a known item. And querying is finding out about the characteristics of an item, right? What are dimensions that are associated with an item by itself or relative to others? And so if we look at the analyze at these high-level actions, this is kind of like our classical split here between discover or explore and present or communicate. And she also adds this enjoy here, right? It's not all data visualization is always about just pure hard facts, but often it's also about enjoyment. And so enjoy would be casual or social. And then the other thing that we talked a little bit about is that especially in interactive visualization techniques, we can also produce something, right? We can create new data dynamically. We can add annotations, we can add records, or we can do some derivations directly in the data set. The mid-level actions, search and query, like we distinguish between search and query based on what do we already know, right? If for search, if the target is known and the location is known, it's just a lookup. If the target is known, the location is unknown, it's about locating the item. If the target is unknown and the location is known, it's about browsing. And if the target is unknown and the location is unknown, it's about exploring. And then the other question that you want to ask for querying is like how much of the data matters? Is it one item, some items, or all? And if it's one item, you probably just want to identify it. If it's some items, you want to compare 2 items, for example, like these 2 line charts here. And if all of the data is important, then you want to summarize. So here's kind of like an example where I want to, like, this is a chart of Greece's GDP compared like after the years of a financial crisis. And so we have the Greece economy from 2008 to 2014, starting from the outset of the financial crisis. And you compare this here to the financial crisis of the Euro area and of Britain, and then to the Great Depression in 1929 by in the United States, right? And so here we want to be able to compare between those items, and that's kind of like the task here. The other thing that is also shown here is like some derivation, right? This change on the year earlier. So we have the original data here, for Greece, and here we show the change, how this changed compared to the year earlier, and we see that it's still going downhill, even up to like 2013 here. And then at the lowest level for tasks, there is kind of like if you care about all data, you can either like spot trends or outliers or features. If you care about attributes, you can look at distributions or extremes. If you care about like these many attributes, you look at dependencies or correlations or similarities. And then for network and spatial data, you want to understand topology and path. We talked about this quite a bit, and the shape of data for spatial data. So here's an example, like this is a visualization technique that shows the trends of how did the job market develop since the recession overall. And like the task that we might want to look at is outliers, right? So for example, if you want to look at real estate jobs, like here. Something is loading today here. Anyways, I can probably show this on the screenshot here. If you look at real estate jobs here, this is actually the fiduciaries and other services, escrow and so on. They kind of like did better than, let's say, land subdivision or home builders or architectural services, right? So here is like what we want to spot an outlier, for example. So now I have a maybe slightly complicated exercise. And what I want you to do is like do a task abstraction yourself. And there's instructions on here. Basically, this is going to be, you've been approached by a geneticist to help with the visualization problem. She has gene expression data, and she wants you to help you. And so I'll just hand this out. You can read through this. There's instructions on here. And like then you should try to do this task abstraction yourself and then think a little bit about encodings. We'll do this for a good 15 minutes, and then I'll walk you through an example of how you could approach this. Section, right? Sure, it's fair. Or is it? Do you have to? That's okay. Yep. There's only one that has. There's not one set. Okay, so was this kind of like an easy exercise? Not really, right? It's pretty tricky. So what I'll do is I'll show you like one way to do this, and then we can talk a little bit about how you approached it and where you were struggling. So okay, first let's look at some of these sentences. So for example, first we have like only some samples show the desired effect, right? So what we learned from this is it looks like we have two different groups of samples, right? So we want to probably compare those two different groups in some ways. So we want to kind of like apply a derive operations to create a new category of like a new categorical value that is adherent and non-adherent potentially, right? Or like reacts to the drug or not. And then we have this sentence here: the differences between the samples caused by differential expression, different activity of genes in a particular pathway. She would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference. So we have kind of like this identify problem here, right? So we want to identify those genes. This is like our identify tasks. And then we want to compare gene expression of pathway genes between the two groups. So we want to kind of like find the pathway that has those genes, and then compare the two groups in that particular pathway. And then we want to identify the outliers. So if you look at this here a little bit more closely, she would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference and what role they play in that pathway. This is like an outlier task in a network, right? So she wants to locate a particular node in a network by kind of like exploring the topology, right? And now what we have is kind of like the tasks summarized here together. And now we can think about the encoding design. So we have tabular data, about 30 samples, about 30 genes. We want to compare groups and we want to spot outliers in this data set. And so here are just some examples: dimensionality reduction, scatter plot matrices, parallel coordinates, heat maps, and bar charts. Which of these options do you think works for the combination of these tasks here and the data we have? What about dimensionality reduction? Exactly. So you would lose some information, right? You could say these samples are different, but you couldn't really tell which genes is causing it. So maybe not the best idea. What about scatter plot matrices? Yeah, but well, let's say 30 by 30 gets hard, right? So you could probably do 6 by 6 or so, but 30 by 30 is just not a good choice here. Parallel coordinates. Again, 30 dimensions, what we know from parallel coordinates is quite a bit, but potentially possible, right? So here, the dimensionality reduction, as I said, doesn't really show the raw data. It's not comparing the groups. For scatter plot matrix, 30 dimensions are too much. We have a scalability problem. Parallel coordinates, 30 dimensions are quite a bit, and we need to do coloring for comparison and use interaction, but generally would be possible. Heat maps and bar charts sound like good options, right? So heat maps, essentially, we can spatially separate the groups, and we can easily plot 30 by 30, and so we might see those patterns quite well. And in fact, this is very common in biology to use a heat map for this kind of task. And bar charts probably work even better because we have 30 by 30, which isn't all that much. And we have this encoding advantage that bars are better. Like we can distinguish the size of a bar better than the colors of a heat map, right? So if it were much bigger, I would probably go for a heat map. But if it's just 30 by 30, I might go for like a group bar chart. And this is what we did. This is like actually a task that I had to deal with as a PhD student myself. And so this is what we came up with. We had like here 30 experiments roughly, and then I'm only showing you like 10 or 15 genes, and we plotted these as little bar charts here, right? And so that works just fine. So that's kind of like a solution to this problem. Now we have kind of like not talked yet about the network problem, right? We also wanted to understand where these nodes are in the network and where they play a role. And so now we can think about our encoding design. We have a network with 30 genes. What we want to do is we want to explore the topology and we want to look up the nodes. If we want to explore the topology, should I choose a matrix? I see some shaking heads. Anybody want to say why not? Okay, recall that adjacency matrices are great for neighborhoods, but not generally great for like looking at paths or anything like that, right? So if we want to look at the topology of a network, we probably don't want to use a matrix. So it doesn't work for topology-based house. What about a tree map? No, because it's not a tree, right? So we can't use a tree map. It's a general graph. So what we need to do is a long node link diagram. And this kind of works well. If we plot this network here as a node link diagram, we could just like plot our table we had earlier and next to it our node link diagram, and then we can combine them through highlighting. And so here would be like an example of such a node link diagram that where we can select certain elements and then we can see that in the table. And that's kind of like, a simplified version of the solution that we essentially came up with. Okay, so any questions? Any kind of, did you approach this completely differently? Does this make sense? Yeah. I don't think you misread, right? It's still like it's still the like basically what you're saying would be the next step of what I'm showing here, right? Like it's I'm just explained which tools I could use to answer that question. And so if I have those two things together, the table of bar charts and my network next to each other, I can exactly answer this attribute question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So if data is so the table, then 30 by 30 is what we have. A numerical value. It's basically this is going to be some numerical value that is unitless but meaningful in the context of everything else. So this means, like typically here, this means the activity of a gene, right? Like the biology behind this is like a gene, or many genes are active by producing a protein, and the protein is actually doing something in your body, right? Like breaking down sugar or something like that. And if you don't have the protein that breaks down sugar, then the gene would be deactivated, and then you couldn't actually break down sugar, for example. And so it would be a numerical value that that tells you how active a particular gene is. And so in cancer, for example, a gene like the gene that causes the cell to die is not active often. And therefore, these cells proliferate and keep growing, and that's what cancer is. So pathways are networks. Yeah, but it's the same. Like the items are the same, right? In the table, like the network is something like an abstract network that we know from the literature, right? We know that, for example, these proteins interact in principle. And so we have this knowledge in the networks. And then we have, for these particular patients, we measure the activity of these nodes on the network. Okay, so I know this isn't completely easy, but it's just like an example of like how it would work in the real world. Of course, you would have like a lot more time to think about this, right, than the 50 minutes that I gave you now. But so in reality, like if you have these tools, I'm optimistic that you would be able to kind of identify a good solution. So next, I want to talk a little bit about design processes. And so designing is what is design? Like, what's your intuition about like what is design? Who thinks design is done with Adobe Illustrator? It can be, or Photoshop, right? That's at least the perspective that I like. In German, I guess it's kind of common to think like that. But it's actually, design is about solving a problem, right? Like you design a car. It's not just about how a car looks, but it's also how it works, how like the engine connects to the wheels and so on. So design is creating something new to solve a problem, and it can be used to make buildings, to make chairs, but also to make user interfaces and visualizations. And design is used in many fields, and it has many possible uses or tasks. Here is like a 20-minute video on how the design of a soda can, right? And even like just designing a soda can is something very complicated, and it's very thoughtful, right? Like the corners and how it's tapered and how it's folded and how the mechanism works, right? This is all like, this is like a long process. If you think back to like old movies, you see that cans like 50 years ago looked quite different, but now we've all arrived on this design solution here because it actually solves the problem pretty well. And so what is design not? It's not about making things pretty, right? Like it's something being aesthetically pleasing is of course great, but it's not about being pretty. Like that's the difference between the design and art, right? Art is about appreciation of beauty or the emotions invoked, something without a clear purpose, and building without justification or evidence. So art really, like the work of art influences us, but in design, the object of design is influenced by its environment and by how users use it. So that's the big distinction here. And you've heard this this term with form follows functions, but the thing to think about is that the function can constrain the possible forms, right? The form depends on the task that must be achieved. And Alberto Cairo, who wrote like a few books on visualization, he kind of puts this very nicely. The better you find the goals of an artifact, the narrative variety of forms it can adopt. And this is a little bit what we tried to do earlier, right? By kind of like constraining, like getting the ideas of the domains, and by trying to put constraints on what is the problem. Like when we know it's a tabular data of a certain size, we have like a limited solution space. And this holds generally true for all kinds of design, right? And when do we design? We design when we have a wicked problem. Wicked problems, this is like a term that is used in the literature, in the design literature. These are problems that have no clear problem definition, and the solutions are either good enough or not good enough. And sometimes this is also called satisficing, right? And there's no right solution and wrong solution. They're just good enough or not good enough. And there's no clear point to stop with a solution, right? I can always improve. I also don't know exactly whether it's good or good enough. And the counterpoint to wicked problems would be tame problems. That would be things like, you know, proving a mathematical theorem, or like solving a puzzle, or playing chess. And like the classical, like I can't talk about design without showing the typical Tacoma Bridge video, right? This here shows this bridge that was designed without really considering, like they forgot about wind, basically, right? And so it worked just fine until wind came in, and then it suddenly kind of started to kind of like swing like this, and it kind of kept increasing the swing of it until it eventually actually collapsed. So I'm gonna jump ahead a bit here. It's kind of amazing to have this footage. So, and this was kind of like obviously a design failure here, right? So they didn't consider all of the constraints. They didn't consider like the elements and the high wind speeds that were happening at this particular bridge. So why does design matter for visualization? Well, we can design with many different ineffective visualization combinations, and we have lots of users with unique problems and data. We have lots of variations of tasks, and we have a large design space. And so that's why we need to use design approaches in visualization. And so this is again from Tamara Munson's book. This one pitfall is to do premature design commitment, and something that I might be guilty of sometimes too, right? Let's suppose you want to solve a problem, and you have just built this amazing tool in your last project. And if you hear about this new problem, you might just think about, how can I solve this new problem with my tool, right? It's kind of the hammer and nail problem. Like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is of course this will not lead to an optimal design outcome. And so the kind of like what you should think about is, here's like our whole design space, and each of these like marks here is a different visualization technique, right? And that's like all of the possible visualizations, and some of them are good, like the plus ones, some of them are okay, and some of them are poor for a particular task and data set. And so here's our technique, which might be okay for that particular problem. But if all I know and all I think about is this particular problem, I might miss out on all the other great techniques out there, right? And so what I first need to do is I need to study visualization to know all of the possible techniques out there. So like I know I can't know everything, right? But I know like a large subset. So that's already important. Then I narrow it down to a subset of techniques that I would consider until I propose a few ones that I really consider much more closely. And then eventually I select one, right? And now we've kind of gone away from this like local optimum, my technique, to like, here's like maybe a solution that is much better suited for that particular task. And so the point here is to think broadly, right? To think about like all of the different things that you could be doing before prematurely committing to one thing. And there's lots of methods you can use to do this, to kind of like develop better designs. So one thing that we do is these creativity workshops. This is actually a technique developed at our lab, where you kind of like, it's a lot about this understanding the domain problem, but also about starting a design process by kind of like lining up these possible solutions. And so the goal here is generate design requirements and promote creativity. And it uses like a lot of different techniques like wishful thinking. So for example, I give prompts to users or to kind of like collaborators, asking them, what would you like to know? What would you like to do? And what would you like to see? And you ask them to not think about any constraints, right? And then you have a brainstorming session where they put this down on posters of different colors. And then later you have group presentations, like this is why we think this is important and so on. And so you kind of come up with like a set of constraints. There's other techniques such as like visualization analogies that helps you identify useful visualization techniques, for example. And this is what this looks like, right? This is a design study we did, a creativity workshop we did together with people at AREP, the lab that's here on campus. And you see people like these are medical directors that we're building some data analysis tool, and so they kind of like use these different colored post-its to kind of like express what they want to know, what they want to see, and what they would like to do. Another thing that you can do, and by the way, there's a website on our group homepage, and you can kind of look at this. There's a paper, and like if you're interested in this, it's fairly well described. I'm also happy to give you like slide sets or even FigJam prototypes if you're interested in doing something like this. The other thing that you should definitely do, and what I've always tried to kind of like embody in also the exercise and assignment, is parallel prototyping. You should try to always develop multiple designs in parallel. The problem is that like if you do just one design and refinements, you might just not end up with too many ideas, right? And it's often also useful to do this in different groups, so that if you have like a group of people that design something together, you can tell them, hey, you do this one design, I do a completely different design, then we pitch and we take the best of both worlds. So here's like a graphic design problem that shows how some art students did design a flyer for an exhibition, and they kind of like a serial design process led to essentially like, basically this color scheme was set at this point, right? They didn't never deviate from it, and even the iconography was set at this point. So they really only refined, okay, maybe the white text here looks a little bit better. They played around with it a little bit, added some figures and so on. But you can see that basically the end result here is exactly like, there's a clear line from here to here. Whereas in this parallel design, like you had 3 different things, and then they were kind of like iterated over and combined. So like there were some good ideas in each of them. There was like the hand in here, then there was like another artifact in here, and so on. And eventually, like this is like probably most people would agree that this is a nicer flyer than this here is, right? Just an example of what people found in one particular paper, how like doing things in parallel makes designs better. Another thing that I suggested that you can use for your projects on the website is the 5 design sheet methodology. This is tailored to visualization design. It's been kind of like used in industry and classrooms. And it's like a sketching as a way to plan approach. And so you have these design sheets. The first one is brainstorming solutions to a task, which is a little bit like these workshops that I talked about. then you have 2 to 4 different principal designs, and then you have this convergence. So this also emphasizes this parallel design process. And another one here is these visit cards. That's also useful if you kind of especially want to work with somebody who hasn't used visualization design before, right? If you like, I think probably for people in this class, it's not all that useful because like, oh, you could consider a scatter plot if you have a correlation, right? You already know that. But if you're working with a group of people who hasn't done visualization design before, that might be useful. It could also be used for teaching. And then like once you have a design, like my first recommendation is to always start by hand, right? Like iPad, hand, whiteboard, like pen and paper. This is kind of like where you start. This is where you do your wireframes. This is where you sketch your ideas. This is also where you should do at least 2 parallel prototypes. But then wireframing can be kind of powerful, right? You have great tools out there like Figma or Adobe XD or Sketch that you can use to do these things, and it can actually make it to look pretty well. But it's also like, you know, these tools are great, and Figma, you can even as a student, you can get it for free. But don't underestimate Keynote, PowerPoint, or Illustrator, right? They can also be very powerful to do that. And if you want to do data sketching, you can probably try out a lot of things in Tableau, and Tableau also has student licenses, right? So you can kind of like build some charts before you like have to implement them yourself, for example. And here's just some examples on how I've used this in the past. So here is kind of like a whiteboard sketch of the set visualization technique we developed. This was kind of the first like time I put this down, and then I went down into my notebook and drew some more details, and that kind of very closely relates to the final implementation here, right? So there's like a lot of time between those 2 things, like a lot of work, but you can see that this kind of like really like already had all of the important pieces of content in here. Or here's another example of how we started out with sketches, like hand sketches, and then into like a detailed design in Illustrator, and then into an implementation, right? And you can see the relationships between them, but you can also see how this was iterated on. Or here's another example, like this here shows a few different sketches of what we could be doing. Then here would be like a first prototype with like notes for a design review, and then eventually an implementation here on the right. Okay, I think we're out of time. This is already almost everything I wanted to say. I'm kind of missing evaluation, so I'll continue with the evaluation on Thursday. Just an administrative note, please submit this activity today if you still have one open. Like this will be the last activity for this classes, and so we'll be closing the activity drop boxes tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.